All right, so we're going to begin our examination of the book of Genesis tonight. As I said last week, we're going to do this sort of as we did with Pilgrim's Progress. I'm just going to open it and read it and talk about it. And we'll see what comes up, okay? So we'll see what kinds of questions you might have along the way, what kind of comments you might want to make, and what we might find from these verses in this tremendous book at the beginning of our Bibles. All right, so it starts with two verses. Let's start with these two verses and see if we can get through them tonight. What did you say? In the, yes. Let's start with the, all right? All right. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. We come right off the bat to an interesting question, and that is, what are we seeing in verse 1? Just in a general sense, before we even look at the words in it, what are we seeing here in this verse? I would suggest to you that what we're seeing here is the author of the book using a rhetorical device to engage us into what he wants to say here, what it is that he wants to outline, what it is he wants us to see. In other words, it's a summary statement or a thesis statement, might even be a better word, a thesis statement of what he's going to present now coming to follow, okay? There have been some who've suggested that this verse is separated from verse 2 in the sense of a historical or chronological sense, in that there's something that God does in verse 1 and then something that God does in verse 2. In provenance, scholarly provenance, this is has been called in the past the so-called gap theory, that there's a gap between verses 1 and 2, whereas you see an act of creation in verse 1 and then a following on of creation or an additional creation in verse 2. I'm inclined to dismiss that by recognizing that what I think you see here is simply the writer saying or stating his intentions first in a summary sense, and then picking up and describing what it is that he has just introduced. So he says, in the beginning, God created. And then goes on to describe what God created means, okay? We have a parallel to that actually in these chapters. You will notice that there is a description of the creation of man down in 26 and following. And then when you turn the page into chapter 2, you see a repetition of the creation of man again. That's somewhat confusing, see. In fact, it says in verse 5 of chapter 2, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Okay, so it seems odd. Wait a minute. We have the creation of man in chapter 1, and then we turn around in chapter 2, and there's no man, and God has to create him. If you read this, therefore, in a woodenly literalistic fashion, you would get the impression that there's two creations of man. But it's a rhetorical twist, okay? It's a rhetorical device in which you say, this is one thing I want to say, but then let me say it more broadly, with more detail to follow. So in chapter 1, Moses describes the creation of the world, including the formation of man at the end, and then stops and says, okay, that creation of man is really important. Let me talk about that again. Let me put it to you in more detail, which is what chapter 2 becomes. It's not the formation of two men. So I would say that that same rhetorical device is being used here in verse 1, where God says, or Moses says, let me tell you about what I want to talk about. God created the heavens and the earth, and then turn around and describe it in more specificity, okay? So there's no reason to assert some sort of literalistic sense between verses 1 and 2 that there is a creation and then another one of some sort, which some have suggested, okay? I would read this in the simplest sense of Moses describes what he wants to discuss and then describes it. So he says, here's what I want to talk about. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it's a broad statement of God, of a statement involving God who creates all things. So he starts with this assertion. Seems like a decent place to start a book about the history of Israel, about its past, writing to a Semitic people wandering in the Sinai wilderness who want to know where they came from. All right? Here's where you came from. Let's go all the way back to the beginning and start there. Okay? Now, a second thing that I would draw to your attention, and this is, I say this, but I'll explain. Moses was not a 21st century historian, and he wasn't a 21st century scientist. He was not writing from within the perspective of a 21st century view of history or a 21st century view of science. He was a man that lived 3,500 years ago in a very different time, very different culture, and a very different world than we have. And I would suggest has a very specific purpose in writing this book. So we need to be very cautious as we read Genesis chapter 1 that we don't read it as though we are inserting automatically this sense of taking our modern ideologies, methodologies, and importing them onto the text. Now, that doesn't mean that the things here don't have meaning. They certainly do. But not from a strictly, let's see if we can make every single detail in Genesis chapter 1 align with our understanding of the world as we see it today, scientifically and historically, okay? We can still hold fast to a literal creation by God because the chapter does start with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So we can be clear that Moses is writing about the creation of the world, but we don't have to try to cram it into some sort of 21st century scientific or historical model. Okay? So I'm not going to try to do that. So I'm not going to try to give you a reason for everything in this. Now, there will be places, and this almost seems like a contradiction to what I just said, but there will be places along the way where the things that Moses reveals do have a sense in which we would understand them from a 21st century perspective. So we can talk about some things in here from our understanding of the universe now as 21st century AD people instead of 35th century BC or 14th century BC people, right? So we can do that in some places, but we don't have to take this and turn it into some scientific or historical rendering such that we can put it under a microscope and examine every detail in order to discover exactly how it works. I would suggest to you that God is God. And the way he does things is probably beyond our comprehension to begin with. What you have is a man trying to capture the essence of the creation narrative. He's also trying to, if you will, push back against those ancient Near East texts that we talked about last week, in which there's a sense in which the creation of the world, according to those mythologies, is various deities working in the materialistic world to bring about men and nations. I spent a little time this afternoon reading the Akkadian creation myth, which is Marduk, who has to kill Tiamat in order to use her blood to create the world. It's really fascinating. Boring. Another word for boring. It's jumbled. It's a jumbled mess of looking at the world from a human point of view. Moses is trying, I think, here to give us a divine perspective of these things. Our problem is that how do you understand a divine God creating a world that we can barely understand even today? Okay? Now, I'm not suggesting, hang on a second, I'm not suggesting that we don't see these things with a sense of, okay, there are days and there are events and there are things. Okay, we can understand that, but it's being written so that we can grasp that, I think. See, that's what I think Moses is trying to do. He's not trying to give us an exhaustive scientific analysis. He's trying to give us a general overview of the events that make up the creation narrative. And we are supposed to actually look into this text and ask, what's the primary point of the chapter? Not what are the details of the events of creation, but what is the point of the chapter? That's what we're supposed to be looking at. And I would suggest to you that's written in verse 1. Okay.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand the point you were making. Is it not fitting it into a modern scientific perspective of these, where you read the account that life is created prior to what we experience as the sources of life?
Right. Trying to explain that in some way.
But this is a simple explanation that God did that probably on purpose to show He was the creator.
Yeah, precisely. Very good. Excellent example. Correct. In other words, we don't have to try to understand why all the plants flourished on one day when the sun, stars hadn't been developed yet until the next, because we don't have a way to do that. And we don't have to. Well, we can look at this text and say, wait a minute, let's understand that God is creating. And that's what Moses really wants us to get to. Because let me also point out something to you. If you look closely at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, you will discover that the narrative that Moses supplies to us of the creation of Adam and Eve is longer than the creation of the entire universe in chapter 1. It's more detailed. And the account of Adam and Eve's temptation and fall into sin and the curse it comes from is longer than both of those in terms of detail. So you have one event in chapter 3 that becomes large. You have another event that's large, and you have the whole universe, which is smaller than that. Okay? If Moses really wanted us to have a scientific diatribe, he could have given us such a thing, I imagine. The Lord could have inspired him to understand every detail of how this works. But he didn't. That's kind of the point. He's moving us quickly to Adam and Eve. He's moving us quickly to Adam and Eve. The point becomes then what goes on beyond verse 26, okay? Now, that, as I said, that doesn't mean we're not going to look at the various things that take place and say, okay, what is this all about? But we're going to have to stop at some point and go, okay, beyond this point is speculation, so let's be careful. All right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You will notice right off the bat that the author of this book presupposes something. What does he presuppose? That God exists. There's no apologetic here for the existence of God, is there? In fact, you could study the Bible flat over and you won't find any apologetic for the existence of God anywhere in it. Nowhere is there a writer that picks up pen and says, well, let me prove to you that there's a God. Let me show you that there is a God by virtue of making an apologetic to you. Nowhere. The writer here doesn't do so either. He simply assumes that there is a God. But there's something else that's presumed here. What else is presumed? What else is presumed in this verse? Correct. That there is a God who pre-existed all existing things. So this is I think this is an important presupposition that's being made here, and I'll talk more about it in verse 2. There is a God, and he created, which implies he had pre-existed all that was created. When you read those ancient Near Eastern mythologies that I was talking about earlier, that's not the presuppositions they come with. They don't start there. They start with the presupposition that there is a pantheon of gods. By the way, they're all polytheistic. They all assume there's a pantheon of gods, and they're all working in some way to accomplish something. Moses starts from a very different place. There is a God who pre-existed all that is created. There was nothing other than him. And then he created. Okay? What does the phrase, the heavens and the earth, imply? Everything. It is a way in Hebrew literature of saying everything. The heavens and the earth. Everything here, everything out there. That's the way of saying it. So when the writers use the phrase heavens and earth, it is this idea of completeness, totality. So God created, it is God who created the heavens and the earth. The word that's used for God here is the word Elohim. Elohim. It's a plural word, so theoretically it could be translated gods because it's plural. But English translators recognize that the Hebrew doesn't mean plural in the sense we think of multiple beings, but plural in the sense of power. Elohim is a term used to describe someone who possesses great power. That's what the plural side of it means. Now, Elohim is not only used for God. It's used also for angels sometimes. It can be used for mighty men sometimes. So it's not just a reference to God, but it is one of the favorite words used by Hebrew writers for God himself, or the name of God. You remember that Hebrews had a tendency to not use the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, because they did not want to violate the second commandment of having, using the Lord's name in vain. So they would substitute in a word like Elohim. 2,500 times in the Old Testament they do that. So 2,500 times you find this word Elohim used. In most of your English Bibles, at least modern ones, they will capitalize the word Lord there under or over Elohim in order to indicate that this is probably a reference to the divine name. This is probably a reference to God by name. Sometimes if you see it in lowercase, it will still be Elohim many times, but it's being used they use the lowercase because it is a reference to the nature of God rather than to the name of God. Okay, but in this case, it's a reference to the name of God, but more specifically, the power of God. That makes sense in this verse, doesn't it? The one who possesses all power created all things. So in other words, what you see is, in the beginning, God, the one with all power, creates by his power all things. So that's where Moses is going. He wants to be clear about something. My fellow Israelites, the God that brought us out of Egypt, the God that brought us to Sinai, the God who gave us his law, the God who is now leading us to Canaan, the God who will overthrow the Canaanites in that place and give us that land, that God is the one who created the heavens and the earth. There's no distinction between the God who creates and the God who has brought these Israelites. So always keep that context in your mind. Remember, this is being read by a 15th century BC audience who were getting this information from Moses. Okay, so always keep that in mind. Here he's speaking to that group. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the beginning of what? Because beginning, by definition, always has to have an object. By the way, it's like the word faith. It always has to have an object. What beginning are we referring to? Is it a baseball term? In the big inning? Dad joke. Very bad dad joke. Okay, beginning of time. I'm sorry, what was the first part of that? Okay, the beginning of that which is related to earth and man. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. The beginning of time. The word beginning seems to have a time element to it, doesn't it, right? We think of the beginning of something in terms of time. All of those things are true, but there's probably a higher use of this word. In the beginning of God's work of creation, why? No, that would not be the right answer to that question. Good try, though. You did. By the way, what you just did was called circular logic. You answered the question using the question. You can't do that. The beginning of his redemptive plan, the beginning of his purposes in all things. Our natural tendency, isn't it, to read this from the perspective in the beginning of time and space. Now, that's not wrong, because obviously God's redemptive plan is going to start into time and space, is it not? But the better analysis of this word is that broader sense of God's purpose now being fulfilled. Remember, on Sunday, I pointed this out. The Spirit of God searches the heart of God himself. And that, Paul says, is what the Spirit has delivered to us. When we think of the gospel, we have a tendency to think of its framework within time and space, right? Men sin, Jesus comes, he dies, he rises. Okay, we think of the gospel as that. What Paul actually wants to do is step back from that and say, wait. I'm not talking about just that in time and space. I'm talking about the very heart of God himself, his entire purposes, all that he intended to do by virtue of being God. See the way I said that? All of what he intended to do by virtue of being God. I would suggest to you that's what this writer is saying here too. In all of what God intended to do in terms of creation, which would then follow with redemption, which would then follow with consummation of all things to his glory, his purposes are now being undertaken. Don't have to say that, no. We can say it, is there no action prior to that plan? Okay, now I have to stop and ask what the word action means. Okay? I would suggest to you that one of our problems, Don, is, and I'm not picking on you per se, okay, but one of our problems is we have a tendency to think only in terms of time and space and the actions of men in time and space. Try to put yourself in a place where there is no time and space, only God. Is there action? Yes, I suppose from our perspective inside the created order, that's the only way we can really talk about it, but is it really action? Is it not really just God's heart, his entire purpose, nature? The Son agreeing with the Father isn't an action, the Son simply accepting the reality of this divine decree that they have between them. Again, there's no way to get that in human language, right? So the beginning here is being used I think, in a framework of, well, we got to talk about this in time and space because we're humans. We have no other choice. So the beginning of this world that God creates flowing out of his divine decree, God created. The first thing he did was create. That's the only way I could put it. You could even make the argument that that flows into the narrative itself because God doesn't actually act, he speaks. It flows out of his nature to speak it. And we know he doesn't have lips and a tongue. So when he speaks, it comes forth from his divine nature. It doesn't come forth in words like you and I would hear, quote unquote. It's part of our problem with trying to make this scientific, right? Or human. The problem with this is that, no, this is beyond our comprehension. So the beginning, I think, here is, yes, certainly as a subset of the larger picture, is the beginning of all the things you mentioned. Time, space, matter, and everything involved with it. But the larger picture of beginning is everything that God had intended to do by virtue of creating. I just used the word had. I should use the word has. Everything God has as an intention for his created order. The world is inside of it. The larger picture is outside of it. Again, I speak as a man because I know no better. I cannot use divine language to speak this, right? Yes. Before this beginning would be this particular beginning would probably be right from a human point of view. But before the foundation of the world would be in the heart of God in eternity past. You can't put a date on it. You can't put a time on it. All you can do is put it into the nature of God himself. Before this, I would say. But again, only if we're talking about it in terms of this physical world in which we can discuss in human terms. Okay. So we're the first verse of this book is this gigantic struggle with, all right, how are we going to understand the nature of God in all these things? Well, Moses is going to give us, I think, a rundown of this as best as we can get it, as best as we can understand it from our perspective, and leave it at that. Because once we get down to about verse 26, we can pretty much follow the narrative after that. If you look closely at this narrative, everything down to about verse 25 is sort of, I don't know. But then you get to 26 and it's like, okay, I can follow you now. We have a world, it's full of people, it's got seas, it's got land, it's got trees, it's got birds, it's got lights in the sky, it's got all these kind of things. Okay, I can insert myself in at that point and understand what's going on from there. So basically the first 25 verses of this book are open to grand interpretation and all kinds of speculations as we try to understand the mind of God. All right. So here we are in the beginning, the very outset of God's purposes to create. He, that is Elohim, the God of great power, created the heavens and the earth, all things. So a summary statement of the realities of what we're about to look at. Okay? Which brings us to verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. All right. Can you imagine nothingness? Pretty tough to do, isn't it? Pretty tough to do. Now, you'll notice I didn't say emptiness. I said nothingness. If you were to take a spaceship and go out there into space somewhere beyond the atmosphere of the Earth, could you find a cubic inch of space with nothing in it? Yeah, you probably could. You probably could. No molecules, no free-flowing molecules of atmosphere or anything else in it, just a square cube of space as a pure vacuum. You probably could. I'm not suggesting you should try. But you could. Let me ask you a question then. You find a square inch, a cubic inch of space with nothing in it. Does it exist? Does it exist? Of course it does. It's existing, okay? But you'll notice what I just did. I put you on the horns of a dilemma, right? Because nobody wanted to jump at my question. You thought I was going to, yeah. Of course it does. And every one of you in the room is probably thinking, well, yeah, it exists, but yet at the same time, there's nothing in it. Yet it exists, even though there's nothing in it. Right, exactly. Prove it. Right. So try to imagine not emptiness, but nothingness, where it doesn't exist at all. Now that you can't do. We are creatures bound to our creaturely nature. It's almost impossible for us even to, I could barely get you to grasp the idea of 1 cubic, inch of nothing, much less, or I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 1 cubic inch of emptiness, much less nothingness. I think personally, I think that what verse 2 is a description of nothingness. Try to write a sentence regarding nothingness. Can you do that? And there was nothing except God. Yet there was a purpose in God to create. So there's a sense in which there is something, in that there's God and his purposes, but at the same time there's nothing when it comes to the world in which we live. I think that's what verse 2 is describing. Look at the language. The earth was without form and void. What does the word void mean? Nothing. Okay, so wait. Let me see if I understand this. The earth is nothing, which means there is no earth. There's an idea of earth in the mind of God, right? But there is no earth. It's null and void. And darkness is over the face of the deep. Deep what? Don't know. If there's nothing, then the deep is simply nothing. And what is darkness? Say that louder. Absence of light. There's nothing there. I think that's what Moses is doing. I think even the Spirit of the God was hovering over the face of the waters. By the way, when the plural use of the word waters is used, it is generally understood to be a vast expanse, is the idea of waters, plural, is the idea. The waters covered the earth. Okay, a vast expanse is the idea of the word waters. It would be impossible for you to draw the conclusion from this verse that God had this big pool of water that he was hovering over that he was going to use to create the world. The first question is, where is that? And wouldn't that be something outside of God himself by definition? Okay, so the language I think Moses is using here under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, the very one who's hovering supposedly over the face of the waters, is this idea of nothingness. There is nothing other than God. God is there. I am convinced that the Spirit of God in that verse is not necessarily, it could be, but not necessarily a reference to the third person of the Trinity. I think it's the whole nature of God who is there. We are told, are we not, in Colossians that the second person of the Trinity is also involved in the creation of the world, right? Okay, so I think the word Spirit here is actually a reference to the idea that God is there and there's nothing other than God, but he is going to make something outside of himself, to become something different from him. Okay? Now, let's be careful here because we don't want to become pantheists or panentheists who would say, well, God is in the rock and the tree and the sky and the sea, right? As though those things make up the nature of God. We deny that because we would argue from the totality of Scripture that God is completely unique from his creation. He is infinitely close to it, that's true. And there is no place that God is not. But his creation is distinct from him. Okay? So there's a sense here in which the writer is trying to communicate this idea of, okay, think about this. Let's start at the very, 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 very beginning. That moment when God, for lack of a better term, acts, speaks. It comes from him now, suddenly. What's there? What's there? Nothing. What's that? It says there's water, but I think the term is being used in the sense of this expanse of nothingness. Okay? Again, I'm asking the question, I would ask, as I asked before, is there some pre-existing primordial pool of water that God had there with him before he created anything else? Well, I think it's this idea of God brooding. The word is actually, the word that could be used is the word brooding. I like that word better. Yeah, it's a sense of he's over this and ready to do something in it is the picture I get. Yeah.
So, of course, water, uh, the plural appears again in the six and starts
Mm-hmm.
breaking
Mm-hmm.
out. Would it be, would the ultimate idea be reasonable that, not talk about the astronomical bodies, but just talk about the Earth, in his first creative action, create this massive water, which I'm told has the neutrons, electrons, protons, and any other elements of it. And then he takes that let's say he created that water,
Mm-hmm.
say,
Mm-hmm.
there it is,
Mm-hmm.
and then he begins to work with it,
Mm-hmm.
separating it
Mm-hmm.
from the water,
Mm-hmm.
left to right.
Yeah, and that is one way that men have interpreted this over time. It's perfectly reasonable. You have this creation of this water, which is this thing, blob of water, which becomes then the formation that goes beyond that to the rest. And as your use of the word waters in those other verses would seem to indicate that something happens here that then gets separated and so forth. Okay, that's one possibility. Uh, I would I would have a different conclusion based on the beginning of verse 3. Okay, because I think what verse 2 is simply describing is this idea of God, to use a chicken analogy, brooding over this to, if I might be so bold, hatch this world that he's coming to. And waters here isn't a description of literal water, but really more of an idea of the expansiveness of this nothingness that's now going to be made into something. That's how I would interpret it. Again, good men have interpreted it differently. And that's what leads me to verse 3. And my conclusion is based on a physicist who came to Edina Baptist Church long ago. I think, I don't know if we were married or not when he came, but I remember him distinctly coming. And he preached on a Sunday morning, and he stood in front of the congregation, and he pulled up this verse as a physicist and says, let me tell you something. This verse tells me how God started the universe, because this is consistent with everything we know about the universe itself. When God says, let there be light. And this physicist said, you know what we now know about everything in the universe? Everything is made out of light, the energy of light itself. Uh, we discovered this, of course, as we've broken over as we've split open the atom, and we've discovered all these little subatomic particles in the atom below the electrons and protons and neutrons down to the quarks and the muons and all these kinds of things below that, that we have, that the universe is built upon the foundation of light as energy, energy itself. Everything is actually just energy informed and informed, form, informed. It's structured such that it produces what we would consider to be solid, right? This is solid, but yet it's built upon the foundations of certain building blocks being light, energy itself. Um, Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, describes this reality, because the amount of energy contained in a mass of an object is equal to the mass of that object times what? Anybody know what c squared is? Speed of light squared. Speed of light squared. Why in the world would the amount of energy in an object be determined by the speed of light? That seems odd, doesn't it? What does speed have to do with mass? But it does, because there's an intimate connection, Einstein discovered, between what everything is made of, and that is light energy itself. So if 186,000 miles per hour, I'm sorry, 186,000 miles per second is the speed of light, you multiply that by itself, you get 34 billion miles per second. Multiply that by the mass of the object in grams, and you get the amount of energy contained in that. How much energy is required to create that object, or to make that object what it is, which is why our sun acts the way it does. You take two hydrogen atoms and you fuse them together to produce a helium atom, and that fusion produces a massive amount of light and heat, which is actually light energy in a different form, electromagnetism. Okay? The world is built out of this stuff. And it's the first thing God said, let there be. He speaks it into existence. Now, this has troubled some when you talk about this in this way, because there is, of course, the belief, the Christian perspective, that God creates all things ex nihilo, which means from nothing, or from nil, which would be from nothing. Well, there are many like me who would suggest that ex nihilo isn't limiting God to creating absolutely everything out of nothing, but rather God creating everything out of the basic building blocks of the universe into the form that does not exist. So it's ex nihilo in the sense that it doesn't exist at this time. But once God creates it, it becomes, by virtue of him taking that and making it. So God says, all right, we need lots of water. We're going to put some above. We're going to put some down below. We're going to separate it. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take some of this light energy in the form of hydrogen, and I'm going to take some of this light energy in the form of oxygen, and I'm going to speak that so that that joins together to produce water. And then I'm going to take some of this sodium out of here and some of this chlorine out of here, and I'm going to put that together and form it into salt and put some of that in there as well. Those forms did not exist before. So ex nihilo doesn't have to mean that God made everything literally from nothing, where he spoke the elephant into existence, and the elephant didn't use anything like anything else. Well, we know that's not true. The elephant's made out of all the same stuff that water is made out of. There are certain elemental realities. And it's not just the elemental table, of course. It also includes all the realities of the physical laws, the quantum laws that exist in the world today. You know, all those kinds of things like gravity and forces, the weak force and the strong forces, and all those other kinds of things that I have no idea how they work. And supposedly bright men can tell me how they work, but I don't know. But what I do know is they exist. God forms them to create the building blocks of the entire universe by speaking light into existence. Yes.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. It sounds like what I'm hearing is God created a finite amount of matter, and then from that finite amount of matter started forming it into different things like that.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that God created finite form of matter. I'm saying God created the realities, the building blocks of realities that ultimately matter would come from. So when he speaks a star into place, he can say, what I want is all of that idea of hydrogen formed here, and boom. Correct. So it's from nothing, but there's basic building blocks of the universe that are there in the mind of God from which he takes, quote unquote. I mean, we know there's a finite number. Well, we don't know if there's a finite number. At least we've only discovered, right? A finite number of elemental particles in this world that are made out of energy that we've discovered so far. Well, we've been able to synthesize some too, even beyond most of the elemental tables when I was growing up. I mean, I think right now there's probably 30 elements beyond where I was when I was a child, if I remember right. But anyways, the point is that all of that idea, including all the realities of gravity and weak and strong forces, all those things are in the mind of God. And he says, let there be water. Water becomes from those elemental ideas that he has. So it's ex nihilo, not in the sense that he didn't have an idea or a plan, but it's ex nihilo in the sense that the formation of that, or well, no, I'm sorry, the pattern of that doesn't exist yet, because he creates the pattern.
So can we say that the first created there at the beginning, God created that was he created something out of nothing?
That would be something completely out of nothing, yes. But it would be at the most fundamental level of all creation itself. Yeah.
I think using the idea, God's idea, sort of in place of some material.
In some way I am, in some way I'm not. Yeah. My problem here is that I don't know where matter ends, or the plan ends and the matter begins. I don't think anybody really does. That's our problem. We're trying to express the idea contra, again, all of these ancient Near East myths which used pre-existing matter to create the world, because they all do. We're trying to contra that by saying, no, our God created from nothing, because he can literally speak it into existence. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that although God spoke everything into existence, he didn't make everything out of different substances. Everything is actually made out of the same substance, and at the most fundamental level, that substance is light energy itself. So I'm inclined to agree with the physicist who says the most fundamental building blocks of the very first thing that God created, he spoke the reality of matter into existence, which would come with it, I think, as he said, and I agree with him, that what comes along with the idea of matter is all the realities of matter itself, including gravitational forces, Stoneric forces, and all of the laws of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics and all that kind of stuff that would come along with that reality. God then, over the next days of this creation, finalizes all of that into reality, would be the way I would say that. But again, here, look what we're doing. What are we doing here? We're speculating entirely on what this looks like. And no matter what position we take, it's all speculation, because none of this was visible to us. Maybe someday he'll roll the tape and show us, although he can't roll the tape because tape didn't exist. He hadn't created it yet.
Well, it looks like in verse 1, he created the heaven, which is going to include the sun. And then in verse 3, what did it turn it on?
You would think so, but he speaks of the light itself in the heavens down a few verses down in day 4. So I haven't seen many commentators who go that path. Many who would say, well, okay, so God creates the stars in the sky and the sun, and then he creates the earth. Well, the problem with that is that he specifically says the greater light and the lesser light in verses down below. And we know what those words mean. What's that?
What are the heavens? He created the heavens and the earth.
Well, as I said, I'm convinced that the words heaven, the heavens and the earth, is simply a way of saying God created all things, the expanse of all things. Heavens above, earth below. Even though there is no earth yet, the next verse tells us that. The earth is void and null. Okay, so the problem is I don't think you can divide verses 1 and 2 and say, well, verse 1 is doing one thing and then verse 2 is doing something else. Because if he creates the earth in verse 1, what happens to it in verse 2? That it suddenly goes null and void. That doesn't make any sense to me.
About this idea of needing energy before you can have matter, physical matter out of the energy, as we understand physics today. I've always thought that God created things specifically to make it impossible for it to have existed any other way than him creating it.
Agreed?
He violated his own natural laws on purpose. Matter before energy, plants before, so forth, so that down the road, so learn about these things, we could not reasonably argue that it could happen.
Mm-hmm. And that is one conclusion we could draw. Again, speculating on this, we could say that God reversed things in order to show his might and his power as God. Okay, let's create the plants first and then let's create the sun on the next day. Freak everybody out because that can't happen. So in this case, he creates matter and then he creates energy to follow it. Well, I think to me personally, the simpler reading is just to take verse 3 and say, God creates the building blocks of energy, and from that all matter comes. To me, that's the way I look at it. I don't think God here has to, in my opinion, weak as it is, I don't think God really has to show off. If he wants to do it one way or the other, he's perfectly free to do that. He's going to flip around days 3 and 4 from our perspective, but it's okay to turn this around in the way we would normally see it. You know. Yes, I agree. Right. There's nobody around to observe this anyways, and so it doesn't really, I mean, it's not an observable reality. It's spoken of as a far later reality. So, but again, the point that I was trying to make at the beginning, and again, I repeat it, we're going to speculate here as best we can until we get to verse 26, where we insert ourselves into the narrative. So you can hold whatever opinion you want to have on this subject. I'm just giving you mine. Okay? All right, so we made it 2.5 verses. Oh, well, no, we made 3. Hey, not bad. Okay. So we'll be done, yeah, 28 years. Is that, you calculated it out? 28 years. All right. Well, good. My successor will take the second half of this book. All right.